Hi and welcome to my channel. I'm Mark on RC 74. In today's video I can finally introduce you the final steps on the build of the round-shaped custom carbon belly of my RC Scrappy build. The target of this part is to come closer to the original belly shape of full-scale Scrappy built by my Patey. My last video ended in the middle of the progress of the belly parts, the mount cover and the big belly part itself. So we start right into this process and have a closer look at all the final steps to the progress you can see here now. The last steps before this video were to shape the two parts to the right raw shape. On the mount cover I had to do some more steps. So the first step we can see now in this video is that I had to shape it to the exact same shape of the mount, so it fitted perfect onto the carbon mount. Because the whole belly was only made of one layer of carbon fiber, it was pretty flexible after curing. So I decided to make a second layer just on the front end and the rear end of the belly part, just to make the part stiffer, that it cannot be bent on both ends. For this I first sanded the area where I wanted to put on the carbon stripes, cleaned the whole areas on front and back end, and cut the stripes into the raw shape, which is a little bigger than what I exactly needed. Then mixed up the 24-hour epoxy I use for all my carbon parts and added the two stripes on the front end of the belly and on the back end of the belly. After the second layer was cured on both ends, the rear end looked pretty good. This was stiff enough for the narrow shape it has, but on the front end it still had a bit too much flex. So I decided to take a carbon rod, which is from an old 450 T-Rex helicopter, cut it to the right shape, removed the rod end plastic part and sanded it and glued it in with epoxy, also with 24-hour epoxy, to eliminate any flex on the front end of the belly. To get the flat area of the belly really flat, also after adding the carbon rod, I put some weight onto the carbon rod and onto the belly to let the 24-hour epoxy cure while the belly was absolutely flat on the lower side. Then I had to cut off all the excess of carbon on the front and rear end of the belly and sanded the raw shape, used the file to get all the detailed shape to make the belly fit perfectly onto the fuselage. Then it was time to sand the whole belly for the first time, so I sanded the outside and the inside of both parts of the mount cover and of the belly part itself. For the outside I sanded just to get a smoother surface and to add some clear epoxy layers. These were two layers I added. I sanded the whole part with 120 grit sandpaper, added a 24-hour epoxy, let it cure, sanded it for the first layer, dry sanded, then added a second layer of epoxy, and after the second layer of epoxy I wet sanded the whole surface just to make it a little smoother. But the finish you can see now of the carbon parts from the outside is just the raw finish. I will add clear coating after the whole plane is built to make the carbon look way nicer. Currently it doesn't look really good, so you can see gray areas, you can see some brighter and some darker spots that doesn't look good at all. But after adding clear coating, there will be the beautiful carbon structure visible. The inside of the two parts I sanded just because I only added one layer of carbon, and I had some spots of the carbon fiber waves where you can see through the carbon fiber. So to avoid seeing through the carbon fiber, I had to paint with black paint from the inside. So I sanded the inside of the two parts, the whole area, and painted the two parts with black paint just to avoid any bright spots in the surface of the carbon. With the black paint added, the result was really good. It looked really clean, no more visible spots in the carbon, and I was pretty happy with the result of the surface so far. Then I had to find a solution for the mount cover to install it on the belly, and my solution was that I used 2 screws on the front side and a carbon latch on the rear end. The carbon latch on the rear end is made of a 1mm carbon plate, which I took from an old plane build, sanded it clean and shaped it to the right size, then glued it on with 24-hour epoxy, which allows me to put the latch underneath the belly, and like this the rear end of the cover is already well installed, so it cannot move anymore. So I only needed to add 2 screws on the front end. To get the right height on the front end and to make it possible to screw in 2 wooden screws, I used some plywood, which I cut it into the right shape. I also had to sand it down the thickness a little bit so the wooden part fitted perfectly between the 2 layers of the front suspension mount. Sanded it down, shaped it to the right design, cut it, sanded it. Before I glued it in, I also sanded the inside of the carbon suspension mounts with my Dremel, with a cutting disc, to increase the grip for the 24-hour epoxy to keep the wooden parts perfectly in place. To get the right height of the 2 wooden parts, I put them in, marked them with a pencil, and put it on the mount cover to get the perfect same angle of the mount cover like the front end of the belly part. Then I glued the wooden parts into the fuselage with 24-hour epoxy, let them cure, and after they were cured, it was time to draw the position of the 2 screws for the mount cover. For this I took the center line of the front suspension mount, masked the mount cover, drew the center line over the mount cover. Like this I was able to figure out the exact right position for the screw holes, then drilled the screw holes with 1 and 1.5mm into the carbon, put the mount cover onto the fuselage, and like this I was able just to draw through the carbon holes the exact same position on the wooden parts, and drilled around 1.2mm holes into the wooden parts, which make the screw perfectly fit. There is a little gap between the carbon mount cover and the carbon belly. Not sure yet if I will keep it like this. The mount cover is not the perfect part I've built, so this is removable. Perhaps I will build a new one later. Depends on how I can do the whole finish of this part. But at the moment I'm not 100% happy with this part. It perfectly works, but in case of the shape, it's not really the part I wanted to have, so we'll see how we will end up with this part. The 2 belly parts I added, they increased the weight of the plane of around 100 grams. Because of this, I tried to remove a little bit of weight out of the stock fuselage on the belly side, where you cannot see the stock belly anymore because it's covered by the carbon belly. So I took the Dremel tool and milled out around 1 centimeter deep almost the whole area of the carbon belly. Also milled away the rear mount for the floats, but I won't use any floats, so was able to remove this, and like this I could remove around 15 grams or something, not too much. The side walls of the front end of the belly were a bit loose just because they're not glued to the side of the belly like the rest of the belly part is. So I added 2 small carbon stripes on the inside of the belly hull onto the plastic part of the stock suspension. For this I cut 2 small parts, glued them into the right position onto the fuselage with some CA glue. Like this I have a way stronger sidewall on the front end of the belly, and the part keeps perfectly in place. Next step was to prepare the carbon belly for gluing it onto the fuselage. For this I had to sand the area where the glue connects the belly with the fuselage on both sides. So I had to sand the whole area again just to increase the grip for the epoxy. I also masked the sidewall to avoid a too big mess of epoxy on the foam of the fuselage. Then I mixed up the 24-hour epoxy, added it on the fuselage and on the belly part, just to make sure to have epoxy on the whole surface on both parts, and put it on the belly onto the fuselage. To avoid any gap between the foam and the belly, I used some plastic tubes for rudder rods, taped them onto the edge of the belly part, so the belly part was pushed a little more onto the foam, and like this I reached a really clean, seamless connection between the carbon part and the fuselage. After 24 hours of curing of the epoxy, it was time to unwrap the whole fuselage, the whole belly, and the result looked pretty good. The only thing was that I had some little epoxy remains, but there's no big deal, so I can sand these remains and the surface is pretty smooth. So really excited to get forward with the build now, to come to the most complex part of the build. This will be the carbon motor cowling, and this is such a complex shape. I have an idea how I will make it, but this will be a very exciting step. First steps of the cowling build will follow in the next video. So this is it of the progress so far on RC Scrappy. Thanks a lot for watching. Have a good time. Happy flying. See you in the next one. Bye bye.